Men, let's gather together. We'll do a drop in, come into this space, and then I'll hand over to Walton and Tim. So if you feel comfortable, please settle in and close your eyes down. Just bring your attention to your breath. Maybe in the course of 3 deep and full and slow breaths, you can do whatever it is that you do to arrive here into this space. Gathering together once again on this Sunday morning. And we'll take a moment to acknowledge the 4 directions: the south, the west, the north, and the east. And the 5th direction, inside us, here and now. Coming together into this circle of men. And that we come together now and we open up our eyes, and we'll start the same way that we always start, by stating our name and the body of water that we're connected to. I'm Nathan, and I guess it's Port Phillip Bay that I'm connected to today. And I'm here. Welcome.
I'm Asher, also connected to Port Phillip Bay. I'm in.
I'm Tim, and this month I'm connected to Seuss Creek.
I'm Walton, and I'm connected to the cold, deep waters of Lake Superior.
I'm David, and I'm connected to the Yarra River, and I'm in.
I'm Alex, and I'm connected to Parramatta River.
I'm Alistair, and I'm connected to Port Phillip Bay.
I'm
Peter.
Tom.
Oh, Tom Cow.
Thanks, Peter. I'm Tom, and like the others, I'm connected to Port Phillip Bay, which today is more like a lake. It's beautiful.
I'm Peter, and I'm connected to the Maribyrnong River.
I'm Grant. I'm connected to Port Phillip Bay. I was just in it, so yeah.
Welcome, men, and thank you for checking in and for being here as well. I'm going to hand straight over to Tim and Walton. Thank you.
Thank you, Nathan. You got something to start with there, Walton?
Well, I was just gonna say, Tim and I had talked, and we had some plans originally, and then Robert bypassed, and so we thought we would kind of just talk about Robert and our experience with him, maybe share some poems and things like that. Tim, do you want to add to that?
No, that's basically what I had thought. It was so synchronistic that we had our time with Martin Shaw last Saturday. And then of course on Sunday, Robert passed. At least it was Sunday for us. And I thought I'd read the poem, Walton, that I started with because I didn't realize how prophetic that poem would be. This is what I read as we began last Saturday with Martin Shaw. And this comes from a poet out of the Hebrides in Scotland. Walton, when he was visiting Scotland, came back and gave me a chapbook by this poet, Angus Peter Campbell. And the poem is called The Fingalian Chant. Now, Fingalian was an Irish dialect from the Middle English that went extinct in the 19th century. So you can imagine the combination of intonations that now it's extinct. So no one's actually hearing it. But so this is the poem, The Fingalian Chant by Angus Peter Campbell. No matter how old the tale, time itself cannot tell it. I knew a man whose story was so old, you could believe the hills themselves would speak it. They only told of sheep and grass and rain. So the man told his story to the beasts and to the birds. And when they didn't listen, to the rocks themselves. The tale was a Fingalian one, and the narrative was irrelevant. What mattered were the rhythms which he sang out there on his own, silently on the moor. If you listen carefully, you think you can still hear the song, but you don't. For what you hear is the wind murmuring through the bog. The master storyteller has gone. And all that's left is someone who half heard the story in the air, far off, like the speech of birds. Our master storyteller has gone. So for those of you who didn't have the opportunity to hear the story in person, the tones of and the body language that came from our master storyteller, you're hearing those far off speeches of birds, and I think tonight, this morning, Walton and I are just a couple of old crows cawing for you guys. So you'll have to listen carefully or else ignore us.
Yeah,
Walton?
I think that, yeah, I think that's well said. I'm glad you you pulled that out. That is appropriate, because that was my I think many men's introduction to Robert was through his work on Iron John and as the master storyteller. Of course, he was a well-established poet before that, but my introduction was actually through story to him. And yeah, and in encountering Robert as I did in about 1984, actually, really caused a tectonic shift in my life, and really changed the way I see the world. And I know he did that for thousands upon thousands of men, but I was certainly among them. I'd never heard anyone work with story in that way. I had been a professional actor and a theater person, so I was familiar with dramatic presentations, but I'd never heard anyone talk about story in that way and delve deep into it and do the kind of soul work that Robert was doing with story. So as Tim mentioned, us being a couple of old crows, I'd like to give you one of Robert's. It's called Ravens Hiding in a Shoe.
Yeah.
There is something men and women living in houses don't understand. The old alchemists standing near their stoves hinted at it 1,000 times. Ravens at night hide in an old woman's shoe. A 4-year-old speaks some ancient language, maybe the Fingalian one that Tim was referring to. We have lived our own death 1,000 times. Each sentence we speak to friends means the opposite as well. Each time we say, I trust in God, it means God has already abandoned us 1,000 times. Mothers again and again have knelt in church in wartime, asking God to protect their sons, and their prayers were refused 1,000 times. The baby loon follows the mother's sleek body for months. By the end of summer, she has dipped her head into Rainy Lake 1,000 times. Robert, you've wasted so much of your life sitting indoors to write poems. Would you do that again? I would 1,000 times.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was the guzzle form. So the poem repeats the 1,000 times. And at the end, it's very traditional also for the poet to address himself, as Robert did there.
Yeah.
And, I'd like to think he will do that again 1,000 times.
I'm glad you picked that poem because I didn't have my book out here. And that's the one I was looking for, Walton.
Yeah.
We're on the same wavelength, I think. And one of the reasons I wanted to pick that was because I was with Robert on Rainy Lake when he finalized that poem. And the loon dipping its head into Rainy Lake, which is an enormous lake that's on the border between Minnesota and Canada. And Robert was up there writing poems. I had invited Robert. I was hosting with some musician friends, musicians and poets. Our good friend Thomas R. Smith was there, Robert, and 5 or 6 musicians. And it was a retreat, just kind of a getaway. And typical Robert, for the first 3 days, he just hunkered into the cabin and didn't come out except to eat, and then went right back in. And on the 4th day, he came out and he couldn't get enough socializing. And that was typical Robert. He was both an extreme introvert and an extreme extrovert at the same time. Well, it bounced back and forth. And I really enjoyed that. I wanted to talk about the first time I met Robert. And I met him as a poet. I was in graduate school, and there was a seminar, and Robert came in, and we did some writing exercises, and Robert says, "Oh, I have to give a reading at this community college. Do you want to come out and be there?" And I found out much later that Robert loved to have someone accompany him. He didn't really like to go into strange places alone. I only learned that later, but that first time I felt, completely flattered that he asked me to come with him. So we went to this community college, and I had only seen Robert in the seminar and knew of his work on the page. And I got to see him perform. And at that time, he was reciting poems and playing the dulcimer at the same time. And so we did this reading with the dulcimer, the first, half hour or so. And he brought the dulcimer over and set it on my lap and went back to giving more poetry and more talk. And I could still feel that vibration on my lap. And I said, that's what I want to do. So I finished and I continued, and my professor later on gave me the article about Iron John. And a couple months later, I ran into Walton and a number of other fellows, and that was in, with Robert, it was 1983, and 1984, everything started for us. So I've got deep roots there. In many ways, they're deep, and in many ways, we've gone far away from one another and come back, and gone far away and come back. So it's delightful. I've watched Robert age, so I feel so blessed to have seen him so many times. Sang with him, where we cawed and honked and sang off key. As one of our friends, Glenn Helgeson, says, it's not very professional, but it's very, very spirited.
Yeah, I think, one of the things I think Robert really modeled was the power to bless.
Yeah.
And he would do it in strange, weird ways that I don't think he was even aware of necessarily. But, setting the dulcimer down in Tim Young's lap, and, and Tim Young's life becomes one of following poetry. And he did that with, with so many men. I think, consciously he would bless some men for sure, but also I think just sort of, it was just his way of going through the world, blessing. And of course, with every there's no blessing without a curse, and no curse without a blessing. So there was always a downside of that too, especially in the early days. I think Tim will attest. We were all terrified of Robert because he would really hammer some guys. At those early conferences, if he thought you were full of shit, he would certainly call that out and things. But overall, I think he blessed blessed a lot of lives and really changed them. And I think he did that, through his poetry, but and then also through his writing and stuff, that people that maybe even never met him, I think Iron John had a profound effect on a tremendous number of men. I've heard a number of stories of people who were just about at their last straw, and Iron John fell into their lap somehow and transformed them. So there's a lot of weird synchronicities around those blessings. A lot of really kind of strange things kind of falling in line. Robert's death, for those, I know some of you were on our Zoom event with Martin Shaw, and Robert died 24 hours, almost, I think, virtually to the minute from the time we closed that circle at that event.
Yep.
And in that event, Martin told the story of the cinder biter, and in that story, there's a king who he's too old to effectively wield his sword, but the sword he has is called Snickersnacker, and he is the last king in the world to whom Odin personally gave the sword. I'm sure I wasn't the only one in that event that got the image of Robert Bly when Martin described that. Because Martin, Robert was sort of, in a way, the last king in the world to whom Odin directly handed a sort of power in that way, in that old way.
Robert's writing shed or shack studio back in Madison, Minnesota, he named, it had been a chicken shed, and he rebuilt it and cleaned it up for his writing shed, and he called that shed Odin House. And he used an ancient print of Odin on a horse for the symbol of the 50s, 60s, 70s press that he published. So, clearly Odin energy was coming through Robert in many different ways. One of the things I truly enjoyed about Robert was not so much, of course I enjoyed his poetry and everything else and all his hijinks and his fearlessness, but he was a great father. And it was one of the things that changed the life of many of the men that I know. Robert had 2 sons and 2 daughters, a stepson and stepdaughter, and he was devoted. I knew Robert's first wife before I knew Robert. And then years later at Robert's 75th birthday, she attended, and it was like a poetry presentation, and many of us read a poem of Robert's, and she was there and read something from Robert's early years, and she actually praised Robert as a father. She knew that her children were in good hands with Robert because he was an attentive father. And to have your ex-wife come and give you that kind of praise, it's an amazing thing. It was an amazing thing. I never expected to see that. So Robert had that effect on many of us.
Yeah, and I think his work really, I think, changed the relationships between fathers and sons.
Yes.
At least here in the States, I think fathers are much more, connected to their children, certainly than they were in the. And if you look at the difference in the way fathers father their children in this country, and maybe even around the world, I don't know, but now as opposed to say in the 1960s. That I think is largely due to the impact that Robert had, in calling out kind of the absent father in the culture.
Yeah. Robert was not ashamed to be a father and an active father. I know that from personally watching the way he interacted with his children. He didn't interact as if he were the great international poet. He was just a dad with his own kids, and I watched that, and it was a great relief for me to watch that and see that he was. How can I say this? He didn't carry his own fatherhood with arrogance. There was a humility in how he dealt with his children, but there was also authority with the humility. So it was really a pleasure for me to see that. We have a friend who, back in 1984, his girlfriend had just given birth, and he was trying to decide if he was going to be a father or not, if he was going to be actively participating, because the girlfriend, they had split, and it was because of the work that we did with Robert in those early years that he decided to become an active participating father. And today, I mean, he participated fully with that daughter. Today, he's a grandfather with 2 children. I was thinking about this week, what would those 2 grandchildren be without this grandfather who comes and sees him twice a week and has babysat? You know, had not Robert's work and our work in those early years, you know, what would have happened? Made a huge difference, I believe. That's just an example. I'm sure there are many, many men who became active fathers because of the work, you know, whether in Iron John or in some of the poetry Robert wrote about his own difficulties with his father, in the lectures. I think there was a profound shift, and Robert was picking up on that before most of us did.
Yeah, I think that's something that's really sort of needed in the culture right now too. It is a sense of having the energy to be a father. I know a lot of you know, younger men are really questioning whether they want to be a father, and part of it's because of, you know, the environmental catastrophes that we're facing and the ongoing ecocide, and, you know, in situations like that. And, you know, there's a great falling apart in the world, which is probably necessary, but it's also painful and difficult. And I know people are, you know, are sort of thinking about like, well, do I want to bring a child into this catastrophe, you know? But to me, I think the, you know, there's something about the courage, having the courage and energy to go on and to commit to that is really important. And I think it's really important that we you know, do not define ourselves as a species, as some kind of parasite or some kind of disease on the world, because we're not. We're, you know, we're an animal that belongs here in our ecosystem, and, you know, we've forgotten, you know, who we are and what our original instructions are, for sure. But it also doesn't mean that we should necessarily give up on that and lose heart, lose courage in that way. So I think that blessing of the nurturing father and the earth father that Robert modeled and also wrote about is really critical right now, especially.
Yep. Are there anything you guys want to say? You know, I know Robert has, you know, his work has personally affected so many men. And is there something that you might want to say about how the work affected you?
Yeah, I'll go. Yeah, I really enjoyed the fierceness that Robert has about, and that question, isn't that true? You know, when he'd say something, he'd finish that, isn't that true? And then giving you that time to ask that question. But yeah, I had an experience last night where I was around young men and they were challenging me as the old man in the room as a bit of a projection. So there's this young man, and like it was a Christmas party, so there was alcohol involved, and this thing around my age kept coming up.
Yeah,
making this thing about my age, and you know that so Father Time, Father Christmas, all this sort of stuff. And I was just listening to this and how he was interacting with his colleagues. So it's a physio clinic, and they're all, you know, talking about work and whatever. And I just listened. As a younger man, I probably would have started insulting him back, but I just listened to what was going on, and I said, "Are you afraid of getting older? And what's that what's that threat and fear for you? Even I was quite intoxicated at that time, but I still was able to sit in that. So I found that really interesting as to why he wanted to challenge me. But I also saw that he was me in that achievement phase of his life and wanting to be regarded and providing all the answers, even though people weren't asking for it. And then I think he was seeing himself in me as well. So there was this happening. And I could feel it, but he wasn't aware of it. Yeah, and he's giving advice. And I said, they're actually not asking you questions. They're opening the space to share a fear they have in their work and their clients. And they're not asking for advice. So you're very good with your knowledge and you're very good at articulating it. However, listening is a skill that you would probably like to develop. So it's really interesting. And then on the other side of that, there was this young guy. He's a big fan of Hugh Jackman, and he's going to ask his girlfriend to marry him. And he was diminishing himself about what he was going to write in his intoxicated state. I said, well, what is it you like about Hugh? What does he mean to you? What do you feel you want to live through these characters he's played? And getting him to tap into. I said, if you're going to contact a celebrity and potentially make a fool of yourself, just go hard. Just say everything that you've got and just lay it out there, bare your soul. And they're to see him light up, I can do that. I said, fuck, why not? What do you got to lose? So it was really refreshing for me to sit there and encourage them to tap into their fire, but also tempering. And I've been sitting with this the last couple of days. It's been really interesting, but it's definitely come from this work and hearing the fierceness and having to look at things within yourself and then seeing how it shows up in the world.
Yeah, makes sense.
I'll give you an example. One time, I was leading a poetry seminar at one of the men's conferences. Robert, when we finished, before we finished, everybody shared their short poem, and there was a man in there who we had gotten to know over the week, and he was very full of himself. And he wrote his first poem ever in his life. And so he had asked for some suggestions from me, and I basically said that, you're using the pronoun I way too much. However, I also complimented some things. And so as we walked out, Robert was walking past the hall, and this man ran up to Robert with this poem. And I've watched Robert slam poets, just cut them to shreds. You have to have a thick skin if you're going to ask Robert's advice. But that was in the earlier days. This was in the last couple of years that Robert was around. So Robert took the piece of paper and he read it, and I was waiting to hear how he was going to cut this piece of paper. And he looked at the man and he said, "Do you mind if I keep this piece of paper?" And he folded it up and put it in his pocket. And I thought that was the greatest Aikido move he could have done, because this man who was so full of himself wrote one of the worst poems that was written that day, and Robert kept it in his pocket. That man was just glowing for days after that. Robert learned something over the years from everybody else.
Probably also meant that no one else had to read it.
Well, of course, yeah. I know where that piece of paper ended up.
Yeah, I think he was also, I think, a genius at bringing different characters along, different,
Yeah.
just incredible wealth of teachers, when you think of, some of them were prominent people in their own right, like James Hillman, for instance, but some of them he kind of plucked out of the crowd, and he did that with Michael Meade. Michael Meade was he was a dental supply salesman that went to some conference and met Robert, and Danny Deerdorf was another fellow, as a musician, but he was a conference attendee, and he got sort of pulled forward into telling stories, and I think to some degree Martin Shaw as well would be in that category, and Tim and I certainly are, and he had a great genius for pulling people forward, and also bringing people into the conference, not always successfully, but often just some incredible teachers, like bringing Martine Prechtel and Malidoma Somé and James Hillman, and to some extent Robert Moore, and Hakeem Adabudi and Orland Bishop, and just Etheridge Knight, just an incredible stock of people who we were all able to kind of bounce around with and hang out with, which is just an incredible blessing. And there's also in the way I'm saying, like as Tim said, talked about the old storyteller is gone and we're remembering the language of the birds, but in a way Robert was also carrying on a line. He had sort of been mentored and loved James Campbell very much, and James Campbell was a kind of a teacher of myth and fairy tale for Robert, and Hillman was also a student of Carl Jung. So all of that, those guys are kind of grandfathers of the conference and of this work. So
there was also it was kind of surprising. I helped organize some of the 3 conferences, or Walton and I organized the conferences in the later 80s. And it was the teachers Robert refused to bring in. One of his best friends was an alcoholic and a very prominent poet. And Robert says, no, I can't bring him into a men's conference. His lifestyle, he's a fantastic man, and he's one of my best friends, but I cannot have him as a role model. So Robert was also conscious of who he wanted at the men's conferences. There was one conference where Martine Prechtel brought in a storyteller friend of him, and that storyteller was an alcoholic. And if you know Robert Bly's poems about his own father, he had difficulty with his own father's alcoholism, and Robert just laid into this storyteller and said, we can never bring this man back, because he was drinking at the conference and getting himself way out of line. So Robert was attentive in many different ways. He was very, very conscientious about what his role was, especially as time went on. Yeah. So,
guys, did you get to see a little bit of Robert's relationship with William Stafford kind of evolve? Because it feels to me like there's a real kind of mentorship happening there.
yes,
as well.
I never, I heard William Stafford read, but I wasn't witness to the two together. But Robert would come back to Sufi quite often and talk about his time with William Stafford. And Bill Stafford was, 12, 13 years older than Robert. And Robert had such a great affection for Bill Stafford. So on a personal level, I do believe they did spend quite a bit of time together, but how much of that time, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I know there was great affection on the part of Robert for William Stafford, and you know, the fact that we kind of know William Stafford poems, I think, yeah, and a lot of people's poems, but William Stafford in particular, you know, is largely due to Robert bringing them forward into the conference work, and really leaning on the poetry of William Stafford. And you know, and I think he, you know, in the larger picture, he did that with a lot of poets. You know, I mean, as far as you know, in his translation work, certainly bringing those poets into the English language in the way he did. You know, one of the things I noted was, you know, in the 1970s and early 80s, you know, the most read poet in America was Rod McEwen, who wrote, you know, I've looked at clouds from both sides now, and kind of airy poems, things like that. It was very pop poetry. The most read poet in America today is Rumi. And that is largely because of Robert's work in translation, and also in performing that poetry and bringing it out. Which, you know, he didn't do alone. Coleman Barks did a lot of translations as well, but Robert was really the one who, you know, sort of made Rumi famous in America, and Kabir and Mirabai, and yep. You know, and exposed, you know, Antonio Machado and the Spanish poets, and some of the Scandinavian poets as well. So really brought them into, you know, our kind of canon in people that are doing soul work.
Actually, Robert translated Rumi, and Coleman Barks said, "Robert, you have to translate more Rumi." And Robert says, "No, I don't have to, you have to." And that got Coleman started, and with John Moyne, and together they started translating. And you know, Coleman is probably one of the best translators of Rumi ever. And he learned that from Robert. You know, in Robert's professional world, he is enormously influential in so many ways. And the very fact that he passed with his family around him, you know, they were all there. It was quiet. He didn't, Robert did not suffer at the end. It is a true testament to himself as a father. So on the personal level, I'm very, very pleased to have known Robert as a father and as a man, and someone who I was able to sit next to and sing.
Can I just go back a little bit? I'm drawing upon your poem, your Fingalian. I call it a Fingalian poem at the beginning. And what struck me about that was my first experience of listening to Robert Bly and Michael Mead and James Hillman. And it was in Ash's lounge room in the early days when we all used to get together, and we'd listen to these extraordinary episodes. And what I was thinking about was the cacophony, if that's the word, of language that the three men used. And obviously Bly dominated in terms of the story delivery, but also Mead had the power of the music, the drumming, he would add in a different context, another realm, if you like, of opening up the mind. And then you had this incisive, very brief commentary from Hillman. Almost, for me, it was like cut through therapy. You know, particularly, he'd make some comments, you know, I remember sort of commentary about the father. You know, what do we expect of the father? You know, and I can't remember all of it, but I'd like your views, you guys, in terms of that extraordinary interaction of these three men and how powerfully they delivered to the men in front of them. Because for me, not seeing it, but just listening it with Asher and the other men, it was just the most extraordinary experience. So yes, I just wanted, going back to how you started, there's something about the sound because we didn't have the visuals. So I'd love to have your commentary on that. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with you, Alistair. I mean, you heard it, and what you're hearing is what we experienced as well. You know, it was incredible to watch, you know, those three, or Hillman and Martine and Robert, or, you know, any number of those teachers kind of bounce off each other. You know, they certainly didn't always agree about things, but they all kind of, you know, I think kind of fed off each other and took things into some very deep places. You know, to me personally, Hillman had an enormous impact, and I spent some time with Hillman, but not a lot of, you know, sort of one-to-one time. I mean, I was at conferences and we would chat here and there and interact, but just from you know, one, reading his works, but then also seeing him at the conference and his kind of incredible insistence on staying with the image. And that, I think, fed very well into Robert being a poet, because that's what a poet does. You know, a poet enters that realm of metaphor. You know, that he pulls, you know, ravens in an old woman's shoe. You know, Robert was very fond of saying, like, I have no idea what that means. You know, and he really didn't. But it didn't matter. I mean, you know, as Hillman would say, you know, you stay with the image. And you kind of see what happens. You don't necessarily have to assign meaning to an image right away. And that was, I think, a really important lesson when we approach poetry, when we approach myth and story, and when we approach what our own psyche is giving us. And, you know, don't look for a solution, and don't necessarily look for the answer. You know, stay with the image. And those guys, you know, modeled that in ways that I think is an incredible gift right there. You know, yeah, I remember Hillman, you know, once commenting that, you know, he thought they were doing, you know, as much therapeutic work in, you know, 5 days, 6 days of a conference as he would do in you know, 3 years in the session room. Sometimes it was, you know, going to those early conferences was like just getting on a horse of power and, you know, striding across all of Asia or something in 5 days, you know. But I think the other thing that was important that sprang out of those conferences were a lot of small men's groups, a lot of gatherings, a lot of guys getting together in Asher's living room or people like that. And I think that work has been more the slow pony, if you will, the little shaggy horse that sometimes appears in those stories. It's you know, it's all, you know, it's also important, and it's probably more important in some ways, but yeah, to have kind of both of those going was really really wonderful. Is really wonderful, because the work still goes on. Yeah.
And then the other part I was going to add is that it was incredible watching their body language. because all of these three men with these incredible intellects, they're on fire. And it was like good competition. They were feeding each other. And at the same time, every once in a while, Robert would quick turn his head, did you really say that? The body language, the eye roll once in a while. Michael would once in a while do, this kind of stuff. And Hillman would dig that in there. So they role modeled healthy intellectual competition and competition with ideas, but it wasn't competition to win for themselves. It was so that everybody was winning. Let's feed that fire. All of us are in this together. And the body language, for me, I had never seen that kind of, it was both relaxed and on fire. I was used to seeing, lectures. I was used to seeing preachers. This was something new. This was something I hadn't experienced. And that's where I felt the fire for myself.
Yeah.
Does
Yeah.
that help, Tom?
Yeah, and I think there's something that was a very kind of a masculine mode of arguing and throwing out ideas, and that was that really had some energy. It's a different way of relating. Men are always talked. We're accused of mansplaining and interrupting each other and things like that. But when it's all men, fucking go ahead and interrupt each other and fight and argue and spit it out.
No scoring of points. I mean, it's so different to what we see on political stages or corporate world, or men with their armor on. These guys were, as you say, unpacking and pushing ideas in front of men who needed to be influenced and changed. It's just the way it ought to be.
You're absolutely right. And to leave a place like that and then go sleep in some cabin by the lake there, you would just be buzzing, after a day of that,
because the fire was coming through them, and we were sharing that fire, that psychic fire. It was exhausting sometimes, but it was also energizing.
Yeah. One other thing I want to say too is that so much of Robert's work was about grief and the appropriate going into grief and grieving the things that need to be grieved, making that offering, not papering over that, but actually going in and grieving the pain in the land and grieving things that happen in life. And one of the things that happened at the very first conference in 1984 is that Robert's stepson died the second day of that conference. He was killed, and he was a young man. He was at university, and he had been taking a walk through a train yard, and far up the track, some train engine banged in, and two cars came, and he was caught between them and killed in a horrible accident. And so, we were at this conference, and I think the subject of the Vietnam War had come up, and there were veterans, and there were, anti-war conscientious objectors, and all people kind of on all sides, but things were a little raw. And Robert received a note, and he immediately, ran out and got a phone call, and he came back in, and he was just sobbing, and his stepson Sam had been killed. And that was an obvious tragedy, but he also really modeled grief. And there's something about that moment that I think just galvanized things for every man there. It did for me, and I know it did for Tim, and I think for a lot of the men to be pulled down into a mature man really grieving and really witnessing that, and not trying to paper that over or be macho or any of that, just going into the grief wholeheartedly. It was an incredible and weird gift, really, but I think it shifted something in all the cells in our bodies when that happened.
And I'll just add that what that did is it allowed us to trust that we could go into deep grief and with other men, we could share that. It could be dispersed among each other, and even though the fear of dark death dissipated for me. All I knew was the pain and the grief, and all that other stuff didn't matter. But I had a trust in life, even in the depth of grief. So
yeah, and
what
to me
is
that
worth, Robert taught me that.
Yeah. And, you know, in Robert's work on Iron John, it's all about initiation, and really initiation is coming to terms with mortality. That's one of, you know, it's going down and, you know, making a deal with the lords of death, and, you know, making that agreement with the goddess that you are mortal, but you also have a destiny. And that's the bargain that you have to make. Not like Elon Musk or somebody trying to live forever. You know, that's that ascentive, you know, thing that we have in our culture that is, you know, in trying to live forever, we're devouring the earth, right? So. I know it's getting close to time. I'd like to and I know Nathan will probably want to kind of take us out. I'd like to just give us this poem, and I think I've read this before here, but I'd like to read it again because it feels appropriate. It's Gratitude to Old Teachers. When we stride or stroll across the frozen lake, we place our feet where they have never been. We walk upon the unwalked, but we are uneasy. Who is down there but our old teachers? Water that once could take no human weight, we were students then, holds up our feet and goes on ahead of us for a mile. Beneath us, the teachers, and around us, the stillness.
Gentlemen, keeping in line with gratitude to old teachers, brothers Tim and Walton, before we close out, I just want to say thank you from me, and on behalf of all the men of this group. It just seems really profound at the moment. But I was thinking, as you were speaking about being in those conferences in the early days, the number of times when I've listened to those recordings and either heard one of you speak or heard one of you referred to, and it just thrills me every time that we're connected back to those roots, via you guys. So, I want to thank you for, offering that energy, that continuity that we can have, down here in Australia, connected to that early work, through both of you gentlemen. But also beyond that, I just want to say thank you for you two as individuals and as teachers, and of carriers of such great wisdom for us. I think, we began these circles, maybe I can't remember exactly, but maybe coming up to a year ago now, and they've just been, profound, and I can't thank you enough for just jumping right in and offering us, what you have. I personally, I've learned so much from listening to Walton as a storyteller, and Tim, your poetry and everything you bring in between. So I think it just seems appropriate now with Robert Bly's passing, just to really honor that. Both in terms of carriers of Robert Bly's energy, but also you guys as men, in and of yourselves. It's just been a beautiful, beautiful medicine for us. So thank you.
Thank you for inviting us.
Yeah, it's our honor to be with with you men. So it's a blessing for us.
And to all of you men who are here this Sunday morning for us here in Australia, thank you also for being here and continuing to show up in this way, because it really is in the gathering of us together that we are able to share in these wonderful stories and wonderful learnings from you, Tim, and you, Walton. And you, Asher, as well, who in many ways has brought all of this to all of us, and we get to share all of this together. So this has been a beautiful morning for me, just listening, and I feel like I just could listen to that all day long, stories and whatnot, but unfortunately we can't. And so what do you say we close this down for now, and give some thanks? So let's just close down the eyes and return to those breaths that we started with. You can just let all of the words that we've heard over the last hour, and just locate them in the body, where they're sitting, how they're moving. And then just let them settle in stillness. As we thank the four directions, south, west, north, and east. We thank the energy of our great teacher, Robert Bly, who is here with us today. And just in your own little way, closing this down within yourself, turning inwards, maybe taking some of this energy with you throughout the day. And with that, close this space down. Thank you very much, men, for being here. Maybe we could take ourselves off mute and say our goodbyes.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Walton, so much.
Tim, Walton.
Thank you, Tim.